Good day. For this lecture, we'll talk about uh, high altitude aviation, space physiology, and deep sea physiology. So for this lecture, we will look at how the body adjusts under these conditions. So first, let's go into high altitude physiology. Now, one of the problems posed by high altitude is that when you go to higher altitudes, barometric pressure drops proportionately. So as you go to greater heights, the air pressure drops, and consequently, the amount of gas or the tension exerted by the different gases present in the atmosphere will also decrease. So, pressures for exerted by nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and all the other gases present in the atmosphere, all their tension will go down as we go to higher altitude. So recall that the atmosphere that we breathe in, or the air that we breathe, contains around 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% will be comprised by the other gases like carbon dioxide, and all other trace gases. So in this table, you will notice that as you go to higher altitudes, the barometric pressure drops. So take note at sea level, barometric pressure is 760 millimeters mercury. This is same as 1 atmosphere. Now, at sea level, these are the partial pressures of the different gases. Let's say they have oxygen, carbon dioxide, the pressure exerted by water vapor, and nitrogen. So if you look at the table here, you will notice that, so for example, let's look at pressure exerted by oxygen. So at having dry air, oxygen tension will be around 159 millimeters mercury. Now, as we inhale, oxygen will now enter the body, and then, of course, recall that the diffusion of gases or the diffusion of oxygen will generally be dependent on pressure gradient. So oxygen, even the other gases, will go to the area wherein tension is lowest. So for example, as we inhale, oxygen tension drops to 150 in the airways. In the alveoli, it will be 102 millimeters mercury. From there, take note that venous blood will have 40 millimeters mercury oxygen. That pressure gradient will drive oxygen from the alveoli going to the blood now. This will increase oxygen tension to 90. So take note, this is now arterial blood. So that's the flow of oxygen. Now, as far as carbon dioxide is concerned, this will also follow the same rule where the flow of carbon dioxide will be dependent on the pressure gradient. So of course, the tissues will have the highest carbon dioxide tension. So this is the tension of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. So once arterial blood passes through the systemic capillaries, the pressure gradient of carbon dioxide from the tissue going to the capillary will favor the transport of carbon dioxide from the cell going to the blood, which will then increase the tension of carbon dioxide to 46. So this is now venous blood, which is brought back to the lungs. So this is the tension of carbon dioxide in the lungs. So take note that this will drive carbon dioxide from the venous blood going to the alveoli or to the lungs and then out into the atmosphere. Now, as far as water is concerned, this is relatively constant. So this is the pressure of water vapor at 37 degrees. So this water vapor is actually being produced by the body. So this is more or less kept constant. Now, as far as nitrogen is concerned, you will notice that, of course, it will also follow pressure gradient. But since nitrogen is not readily utilized by the body, it is more or less it just stays in the body, doesn't do much. Now, if you get the total pressure of these gases, so at the bottom-most part of this table, this is now the total pressure of these gases. Now, take note, the gas law that we will follow as far as this table is concerned is Dalton's law. So Dalton's law states that the total pressure of the gas is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of the individual gases that will comprise it. Now, at sea level, when we hyperventilate, partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. So take note of your annotation. So capital A means alveoli, whereas small a means arterial blood. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli when we hyperventilate is maintained. Since at sea level, no, even if we hyperventilate, the oxygen tension remains the same. Thus, the pressure of oxygen in the alveoli will still remain the same. However, for carbon dioxide, when we hyperventilate, recall that carbon dioxide is being blown off if we hyperventilate. So carbon dioxide will gradually decrease at sea level. However, at higher altitudes, the oxygen tension present in the air will slowly decrease. This will slowly decrease. So because of this, there is a gradual decrease in oxygen tension in the alveoli. Since the amount of oxygen in the alveoli is reduced, less oxygen will now go into the blood. This will be detected by your peripheral chemoreceptors, namely the carotid and aortic bodies. So this will now, or these peripheral chemoreceptors now will be stimulated and they will send signals to the respiratory center, namely the dorsal respiratory group, increasing now the ventilatory drive. So this will now induce hyperventilation. So when we go to higher altitudes, expect that we hyperventilate because of the decrease in O2 tension in the air. Now, as we go to higher altitudes, the oxygen present in the alveoli will be dilated further because of the production of carbon dioxide and water. So remember that the body will keep on producing carbon dioxide at a constant rate. So this is due to metabolism, and water vapor is present. So water vapor typically contributes around 47 millimeters mercury. So based on Dalton's law, the pressure exerted by carbon dioxide and water now will further dilute the amount of oxygen present. No? So that follows Dalton's law. So if you look at the table here, so this is at sea level, those in black font. So this is the pressure exerted by water vapor. So water vapor is being produced by the body. The amount of carbon dioxide in the alveoli, and the amount of, or the tension of oxygen in the alveoli. Now, when you go to higher altitudes, like what we've mentioned, barometric pressure drops, and consequently the tension exerted by the gases will also drop. Now, as far as water is concerned, so let's look at 30,000 feet above sea level. So at 30,000 feet above sea level, notice that barometric pressure will drop now to 226 millimeters mercury. Now, take note of the partial pressures of the gases. So as far as water is concerned, so this is water vapor, this is maintained at 47 millimeters mercury, simply because the body will keep on producing water vapor. So water vapor will exert around 47 millimeters mercury. Now, for carbon dioxide, because we hyperventilate when we go to higher altitudes, carbon dioxide decreases to 24, no? And oxygen drops to 18. Now, these values are typically true if the individual is unacclimatized, no? If the individual is unacclimatized. But after a few hours, up to several days or however long the person will stay at the greater altitude, the body will now acclimatize. So what typically happens is that we hyperventilate. So when we hyperventilate, take note, water vapor is still the same, 47 millimeters mercury, because this is being produced by the body. For carbon dioxide, since hyperventilation blows off more carbon dioxide in the alveoli will drop to 7, and oxygen in the alveoli will increase up to 30. So from 18, an acclimatized value, it goes to up to 30. So this is your acclimatized value now. So that is happening, or that happens when the individual hyperventilates. Okay, so take note, the amount of oxygen or the tension, the tension of water vapor in the alveoli and the tension of carbon dioxide in the alveoli are more or less constant when we go to higher altitudes. But since when we hyperventilate, much of carbon dioxide will be blown off, expect that carbon dioxide to decrease in proportion to our degree of hyperventilation. Now, for oxygen and nitrogen, the amount or the tension of oxygen and nitrogen in the alveoli will decrease proportionately with atmospheric pressure. So as you go to higher altitudes, the oxygen and nitrogen tension in the air that we breathe will go down. Consequently, the amount or the tension of oxygen in the alveoli will also decrease. Now, at 10,000 feet, so 10,000 feet is a special number because at 10,000 feet, O2 saturation is around greater than 90%. And if you look at the O2 dissociation curve, a 90% O2 saturation means PaO2. So this is the pressure of oxygen in arterial blood. PaO2 now is 60 millimeters mercury. So this is the value being obtained by your arterial blood gas. So this is true up to 10,000 feet above sea level. No? So this means that at 10,000 feet, more or less O2 saturation is at 90%. However, if you go higher than 10,000 feet, O2 saturation will progressively decline. So with that, as you go to higher altitudes, no, the ventilatory drive will progressively increase. So this will now induce hyperventilation. So with that, the amount of carbon dioxide in the alveoli will progressively go down since as we hyperventilate, more carbon dioxide is blown off. When we hyperventilate also, the body is trying to maintain tension of oxygen. So at 10,000 feet, more or less, oxygen tension in the alveoli, no, is enough to maintain an O2 saturation of 90%. But of course, as you go to higher altitudes, the PaO2 will then drop. No? PaO2 decreases. Take note also, since water vapor and carbon dioxide tension are more or less maintained by the body, these gases will dilute the oxygen present in the alveoli. Okay, so because of the decrease in oxygen, hypoxic problems may happen. So as you go to varying altitudes, the amount of oxygen in the alveoli and in arterial blood may vary. So this will now depend on the altitude. And of course, it will depend on the ventilatory drive. In order to mitigate this problem, mountaineers typically take additional oxygen. So for example, if you breathe pure oxygen, then the air found within the alveoli are replaced by pure oxygen. So most of alveolar air now becomes oxygen. So with that, O2 saturation is greater than 90%, no? At 39,000 feet. This is only true if you're breathing in pure oxygen. And if you go beyond 39,000 feet, then it will proportionately decrease. So for example, if you look at the table here, this table will show to us unacclimatized value in red. So take note of your altitude here. So this is your barometric pressure at varying altitudes. So let's look at the pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the alveoli, oxygen in the alveoli, and O2 saturation within each height or altitude. So take note at sea level. So of course, expect that PaCO2 and PaO2 are more or less normal, giving us an O2 saturation of 97%. So when you get your O2 saturation at sea level, it should be around 97%, or normal range is 95 to 100%. Now, of course, as you go to higher altitudes, barometric pressure drops, as you can see here. So with that, based on Dalton's law, the tension of the different gases will also decrease. So take note, oxygen in the air will drop as you go to higher altitudes. So looking at 10,000 feet, take note that PaCO2 now decreases at 36 and PaO2 drops from 104 to 67 millimeters mercury at 10,000 feet above sea level. Now, if alveolar oxygen is at 67 millimeters mercury, this will give us around 90% O2 saturation. No? Now, recall, if you will look at 90% O2 saturation in the oxygen dissociation curve, this is around 60 millimeters mercury arterial oxygen. So PaO2, no? The pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, or essentially dissolved oxygen in plasma. So 90% O2 saturation is tantamount to having a 60 millimeters mercury oxygen in arterial blood. Now, recall that if you go lower than 60 millimeters mercury, then you will have hypoxic problems. So this is the reason why when we get ABG, if you have a PaO2 of 60 millimeters mercury or below, you need to refer this to your senior or your pulmonologist, or to a specialist, because the patient will now have or will now experience hypoxia. So the same is true if you go beyond 10,000 feet above sea level. Now, these values are your unacclimatized values, meaning the patient or the person is breathing normally. However, as we go to higher altitudes, of course, as oxygen tension in the blood goes down, this will be detected by the peripheral chemoreceptors, increasing now our ventilatory drive. So these values now are the acclimatized values. No? So these happen when ventilation already increases. So take note for your carbon dioxide. As you go to higher altitudes, our ventilatory drive increases. So this will now blow off more carbon dioxide. So take note, there's a drop in your carbon dioxide tension. For oxygen, it will slightly increase. And that increase in alveolar oxygen tension, this will also slightly increase O2 saturation. So take note at the tension of oxygen in the alveoli becomes now 77 compared to 67. This will slightly increase your O2 saturation from 90 to 92. So there's a slight increase in O2 saturation, and expect that your PaO2, or the amount of oxygen dissolved in plasma, will also increase. Now, these values are particularly true at 10,000 feet above sea level. If you go beyond that, then expect hypoxia to happen since O2 tension in the atmosphere drops, O2 tension in the alveoli will drop, oxygen present in the blood, both O2 saturation and dissolved in plasma, they will also decrease. So when you read your books, it is said that humans, we are able to climb up to 10,000 feet above sea level, provided we become acclimatized to these altitudes. At greater heights, hypoxic problem will occur. Now, in order to solve this, we can use or we can breathe additional oxygen. Now, this table will show to us the tension of the gases when we breathe pure oxygen. So, take note of your partial pressure of your gases. So, for example, so again, this is your barometric pressure as you go to greater altitudes. Now, if we give pure oxygen, expect that O2 tension in the alveoli would increase. So in this table, this will show to us the drastic increase in O2 tension and the corresponding O2 saturation. So if you look at the table here, notice that at 30,000 feet, O2 saturation is maintained at a high amount, 99%. So this will, or breathing pure oxygen will sustain us or will prevent hypoxia up to 30,000 feet. So if you will notice, by the way, this is particularly true if if you're, let's say, you're in an airplane and the cabin pressure is not increased or it's not pressurized. So you just have O2 supplementation. So what's happening is that if you breathe in pure oxygen at 30,000 feet, O2 saturation is at 99%. Of course, if you go beyond that, this will drastically drop. So let's say at 40,000 feet, O2 tension in the alveoli is now at 58 millimeters mercury, giving us O2 saturation of 84. So this is now in the realm of hypoxia. So what does this table mean? So this means that by breathing pure oxygen, no, we can actually tolerate greater altitude. So we can go as high as 30,000 feet. So if you will notice, if we fly a plane, take note the cabin within the plane is pressurized. So notice that the altitude of the plane is typically around 30 to 35,000 feet above sea level. No? So that will maintain more or less adequate amounts of oxygen, giving us normal O2 saturation, even at higher altitude. Of course, if you go beyond 35,000 feet, then O2 tension drops. Okay, so because O2 tension drops as you go to higher altitudes, again, this will be detected by your carotid and aortic bodies. They will increase now our ventilatory drive. So it will stimulate the respiratory center, increasing our minute ventilation. So if you read your books, at 8,000 feet above sea level, PaO2 is around 60 millimeters mercury. So take note, this is your oxygen in the alveoli, giving us an O2 saturation of around 90 to 93%. However, at 16,000 to 20,000 feet, there's a 65% increase in ventilation until O2 saturation is around 70 to 75%. But an O2 saturation of 70 to 75% is already in the realm of hypoxia. No? So because of this, recall now problems or reactions of the body when we experience hypoxia. Okay. At 9,000 feet above sea level, typically we are asymptomatic. So we don't normally experience symptoms at 9,000 feet above sea level. However, if you go to higher altitudes, most especially if the individual is unacclimatized, so at greater than 12,000 feet above sea level, so you will now experience symptoms of hypoxia, drowsiness, no, lassitude, or there's a feeling of being tired or exhausted, mental fatigue, headache, nausea. Sometimes people experience euphoria. There is a decrease in judgment, memory, and even discrete motor movements. So these are symptoms of hypoxia. If you go to higher altitudes like 18,000 feet above sea level, individuals would normally experience seizures. And if you go 23,000 feet, the severe drop in oxygen will produce coma and even death. Now, if I remember correctly, I think Mount Everest is around 28 or 29,000 feet above sea level. So that's the peak of Mount Everest. Now, one way of preventing these symptoms is through acclimatization. So like what we've mentioned, because of hypoxia, this increases our ventilatory drive, no? And this is one way of somehow mitigating the effects of hypoxia. So this will reduce now adverse effects and increase our tolerance as we go to higher altitudes. So what's happening with the body? Now, as you go to higher altitudes, in the first few days, from hours to days, pulmonary ventilation will now increase. No? So as oxygen tension drops, pulmonary ventilation increases. So this will somehow improve O2 tension in the alveoli and consequently O2 saturation in the blood. But in the first few hours to first few days, up to 2 days, your hyperventilation will supposedly produce respiratory alkalosis. So pH of the extracellular fluid will increase. So if you will recall your acid-base balance, an increase in your extracellular fluid pH will actually suppress your respiratory center. So you now have two factors that are antagonistic, no? In as far as activating the respiratory center. So on one hand, you have hypoxia that will increase ventilatory drive. On the other hand, you have respiratory alkalosis that will reduce the ventilatory drive. So that typically happens in the first 2 days. Now, from day 2 to day 5, because of the respiratory alkalosis, the kidneys will now excrete excess bicarb. So remember that the body will try to maintain normal pH as much as possible. So in the event respiratory alkalosis happens, the kidneys will now excrete excess bicarb. So what happens now is that your kidneys, by eliminating excess bicarb, will bring the pH back to normal. It will bring the pH back to normal. So what you have left is your hypoxia augmenting now the ventilatory drive. So after 2 to 5 days, renal adjustments would have occurred. What you have left now is the decrease in O2 tension, increasing ventilatory drive. So from then on, ventilation now is increased. No? So you maintain a high ventilation. Other adjustments, of course, hypoxia will induce erythropoietin synthesis. So you produce more red blood cells. This will increase your hemoglobin content, your hematocrit, and it will also increase your blood volume. Also, because of hyperventilation, there will be increased diffusing capacity in the lungs, particularly for oxygen. No? Just like what's happening when we engage in exercise, as we hyperventilate, your type 2 pneumocytes will produce more surfactant, recruiting more alveoli. So the total surface area of the respiratory membrane increases. So your lung volume would increase. Sympathetic activation because of hypoxia will increase cardiac output. So this will increase pulmonary capillary blood flow and pulmonary arterial pressure. Now, recall that when the alveoli are hypoxic, you induce vasoconstriction in the pulmonary vessels. The opposite happens in the systemic circulation. When hypoxia happens, the systemic circulation dilates. No? So, in the lungs, pulmonary vessels will constrict because of hypoxia. This will now increase pulmonary arterial pressure. So, you will have pulmonary hypertension. So, because of this, the right side of the heart or the right ventricle will have to exert more effort. So with that, part of your acclimatization is increased vascularization of the right ventricle and increased muscle mass of the right ventricle. Should you stay for prolonged periods of time within or at higher altitudes. So in the systemic circulation, angiogenesis will happen. So more blood vessels will be formed in order to supply more oxygen to your tissues. Now, as far as the tissues are concerned, you have increased oxygen uptake. You produce more mitochondria. You have more myoglobin. 2,3-DPG production is also increased. So with that, if you will recall your Bohr effect, increased 2,3-DPG will promote your oxygen release going to the tissue. So more oxygen is delivered to the tissue. So because of hypoxia, this will now induce production of your HIF or your hypoxia-inducible factors. So these are various substances that will help us acclimatize to higher altitudes. So these include your VEGF or your vascular endothelial growth factors. So they will now promote angiogenesis. This will also induce erythropoietin production, increase activation of your mitochondrial genes. So you now have more efficient utilization of oxygen. That's for aerobic metabolism. And you also increase glycolytic enzymes for anaerobic metabolism. You also produce more nitric oxide, most especially in the systemic circulation, because your nitric oxide will promote systemic vasodilation. Now let's look at the differences between your mountain dwellers, your native mountain dwellers, and your sea level dwellers. So when we talk about mountain dwellers, these are individuals that were born and they have lived their lives, all their life, at higher altitudes. So in this graph, so the red line here would be your mountain dwellers, whereas the blue graph here would be your sea dwellers. So this is your arterial values, and these are your venous values. Comparing the two, take note that your mountain dwellers will have more amount of oxygen present in the blood. So notice that the arterial values, no, for your mountain dweller is higher compared to your sea dweller. The same is true for your venous blood. So essentially, mountain dwellers will have more oxygen present in their blood. Also, their work capacity, the mountain dwellers, are higher compared to sea level dwellers. Simply because since they are acclimatized for higher altitudes, no, they have lived their life all their life at higher altitudes, their work capacity is greater. So this is due to various phenotypic adjustments, no? So like for example, their chest size is bigger, expect their breathing capacity to be higher, cardiac size and cardiac output is greater compared to sea level dwellers. Of course, they have more oxygen present in the blood. So this will now result to greater work capacity performed by your mountain dwellers. Now, for those who are not properly acclimatized, then mountain sickness may happen. So for example, you have acute mountain sickness. This typically happens when you have sea dwellers that rapidly go up to higher altitudes. So even at 6,500 feet above sea level, if the ascent is too rapid, the individual may not have enough time to be acclimatized to the condition at higher altitude. So here, there is a drop in mental proficiency. Patients may experience headache, fatigue, GIT symptoms, dizziness, or sleep disturbances. Now, exaggeration will aggravate the symptoms because exertion of the skeletal muscle will increase the oxygen demand. Since the patient or the individual has not been acclimatized properly yet, then effects of hypoxia will be more prominent if the person would exercise or would exert more effort. So these symptoms typically appear within 6 to 10 hours after ascent. Now, as the individual becomes acclimatized, these symptoms will subside in 1 to 2 days. So the body will now slowly acclimatize. So it is expected that these individuals will gradually hyperventilate. No? Now, expect some manifestations like retinal hemorrhage or peripheral edema would occur because the hypoxic conditions will cause vasodilation of the systemic capillaries or systemic blood vessels. More detrimental conditions would be your high altitude pulmonary edema and your high altitude cerebral edema. So remember that when hypoxia is present, pulmonary vessels constrict. No, pulmonary vessels constrict when hypoxia is present. And the systemic vessels will dilate if hypoxia is present. So systemic vessels will dilate. So for your high altitude pulmonary edema, the vasoconstriction will now induce an increase in your capillary hydrostatic pressure. No? So this will now push fluid out into the interstitium, causing now your high altitude pulmonary edema. So this typically happens during acute mountain sickness, most especially if you ascend to greater than 10,000 feet above sea level. So here you will experience fatigue, dyspnea, cough, no? You have frothy sputum. And typically, descending and giving O2 supplementation will alleviate these symptoms. No? Now, for your high altitude cerebral edema, so this is due to vasodilation of the systemic circulation. So, with vasodilation, this will now increase blood flow. This also increases your hydrostatic pressure. So the fluid will also go out into the interstitium. So high altitude cerebral edema typically happens when you ascend to heights greater than 9,000 feet above sea level. So here, you can experience headache, fatigue, visual impairment, bladder dysfunction, bowel dysfunction, loss of coordination, paralysis, and confusion. Now, typically, we can give dexamethasone to reduce the symptoms of cerebral edema, and descending to lower altitudes will typically alleviate the symptoms. So to mitigate the problems of acute mountain sickness, individuals should be acclimatized. No? Now, susceptibility will depend on several factors. So rate of ascent. So of course, if you ascend quickly or rapidly, then the risk of having acute mountain sickness increases. So typically, ascent should be slow. Sometimes there are stages to that. Like for example, you go higher and then stay there for a while, be acclimatized, no? And then as you go, and from there you go furthermore up and then stay there for a while. So ascent should be a little bit slow. The altitude will also affect the risk of acute mountain sickness. Of course, expect that at higher altitudes or at greater altitudes, acute mountain sickness is more prevalent. Like what we've mentioned, physical activity, too much exertion will increase symptoms of your sickness and individual susceptibility. Like for example, if you have pulmonary problems or cardiac problems or circulatory problems, then this will increase your risk of developing mountain sickness. So to prevent, of course, slow ascent and increase water or carbohydrate intake, few frequent meals or small frequent meals, sorry. Reduce the intake of alcohol and salt. Now, there's another condition called chronic mountain sickness. So this typically happens if the individual lives at higher altitudes for several years. No? If you live for several years above 2,500 meters above sea level, then the body will now acclimatize or acclimatize to that altitude. So here, because of hypoxia, erythropoietin is produced, red blood cells are produced, then the patient may have polycythemia. Hematocrit increases, oxygen carrying capacity increases. But take note, since you have more red cells and hematocrit increases, this will increase the viscosity of blood, increasing now total peripheral resistance. So expect blood pressure to increase. There will be VQ mismatch. Now, some areas in the lungs will have dead space. Some areas in the lungs will behave as a shunt. Like for example, if blood vessels in the lungs constrict because of hypoxia, so let's say ventilation is maintained or you increase it even. So if ventilation is increased, but blood vessels will constrict, no, in the pulmonary circulation, this will now behave as a dead space. So this is a VQ mismatch. So hypoxia can happen. So here you have ventilation with reduced perfusion. Now, sometimes since perfusion is reduced, blood is now shunted to the extraalveolar vessels. So these are the vessels that are not normally ventilated. So since this blood is shunted to vessels that are not ventilated, so it now behaves as a shunt. So you have less ventilation, but perfusion is present. That now behaves as a shunt. So that happens in some regions in the pulmonary system. So in that regard, the pulmonary system behaves as a shunt. So because of this VQ mismatch, then hypoxia is present in these patients. So remember, if hypoxia is present, you have pulmonary hypertension. So you have vasoconstriction of your pulmonary vessels. Whereas in the systemic circulation, you have generalized vasodilation. So because of this, the heart will have to exert more effort just to deliver blood going to the systemic circulation. So you now have risk of developing congestive heart failure, right side heart enlargement because of pulmonary hypertension, and chronic mountain sickness may lead to death if the body is not able to adjust properly. So symptoms include headache, dizziness, tinnitus, palpitations, breathlessness, sleep disturbance, fatigue, mental confusion, no? Cyanosis because of hypoxia, no? Dilation of veins, hemoglobin increases up to 2 grams per liter, hematocrit would increase, so blood viscosity increases, O2 saturation drops, no? So descent typically alleviates your symptoms, and since you have too much blood present, sometimes we do phlebotomy. So you remove some blood from the patient in order to mitigate the symptoms of chronic mountain sickness. So to prevent this, so natural acclimatization should happen. So this is only observed among natives. So these are individuals who have lived all their life at higher altitude. So they have greater chest size, greater ventilatory capacity to body mass ratio, greater cardiac size, no? Cardiac output is higher. Naturally, they have polycythemia, PaO2 or oxygen in the alveoli may be low, but because of the adjustments made by their body, O2 delivery to the tissue are maintained or sometimes increased. Other problems posed by higher altitudes is temperature. So as you go to higher altitudes, the temperature of the surrounding environment drops because gravity affects the amount of air or air molecules present. Now remember that the heat of the Earth is typically coming from infrared heat coming from the ground, no? So at sea level, it's warmer compared to higher altitudes because at sea level you have, of course, more matter there. So more solid, liquid, and gas molecules. And all of these materials or matter will exert or will emanate some form of infrared heat. Now, as you go to higher altitudes, you have less and less of these molecules, no? Less solid, less liquid, less air molecules. So because of this, air temperature drops. So other problems would include, of course, hypothermia and frostbite. Now, and as far as aviation is concerned, when you go to higher altitudes, another problem other than hypoxic problems would be problems posed by acceleratory forces. So here you have your linear acceleration and deceleration and angular and centrifugal acceleration. So in this formula, you have your force that's equal to the mass times the square root, times the square of your velocity divided by your angular radius. So based on this formula, the greater the mass or the greater the velocity, the force exerted by the body increases. So they're directly proportional and inversely related to the angular radius. So for example, if the turn is quite sharp, so this means the angular radius is low, therefore the force increases. So you can just imagine if the turn is very rapid compared to uh, a turn that is, the turning radius is a little bit wider. So a rapid turn, no, an acute angle will have a greater force. Now these forces are described to be your G forces, no? Because these forces will act on the body, on our body, and certain fluids, like for example, our circulatory system, will be affected by these linear, angular, and centrifugal acceleration and decelerations. When we talk about a positive G, so this is the force pressing onto the person due to gravity. If there is positive 1 G force, the force is equal to the weight of the person. So the force is equal to the weight of the person. If you go 5 Gs, so this means that the force is 5 times the body weight of the person. So the greater the G force, no, the more detrimental the effects are on our body fluids. The same is true when you have negative G force. So a negative G force is a force which throws a person due to deceleration, no? So for example, if you are traveling at a certain speed, and let's say the vehicle suddenly stops, you are thrown forward. So that's an example of a negative G force. So this is mainly due to inertia. So a negative 1 G force means this is equal to the weight of the person, and a negative 5 G force means this is force that is 5 times the weight of the person. So, like what we've mentioned earlier, it is the body fluids that are most affected. Like, for example, in the circulatory system. So, when you have a positive G, no, let's say you're standing, and then you are suddenly catapulted up, no, or launched up into space. No? So, that's a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you're standing and you are launched into the upper atmosphere. So because of the positive G, no, blood, no, will now be translocated to the more dependent portions of the body. So the effect there is there's an increase in hydrostatic pressure in the lower extremities, vasodilation in the more dependent parts, venous return will go down, and cardiac output will go down. Since venous return and cardiac output are decreased, so you now have less blood being pumped by the heart. So less blood will go to your systemic circulation. More importantly, going into your cerebral circulation. Now, of course, we have to, there are ways to tolerate positive G. So, for example, depending on your body size, posture. So, for example, if you are in a reclining position, no, muscle strength. So, if you are able to clench your muscles, no, or contract your muscles, preventing now or enhancing now, venous return, no. The direction and duration of the centrifugal force will also affect our tolerance, no? And of course, the activity of the baroreceptors. So with sympathetic activation, this will try to mitigate the problems of your positive G. So ordinarily, if you are properly trained, we are able to tolerate positive 3.3 G. Beyond that, let's say greater than 4G, positive 4G, no? Much of the blood will now go to the more dependent portion. So less blood going to your cerebral circulation, you'll have loss of consciousness. And at greater than 6G, less blood flow going to your central nervous system. It becomes ischemic, hypoxic, then death may happen. No? So again, if you are properly trained, no, we are able to withstand greater G forces. Now, if you're in a sitting position at positive 10 to 15 Gs, no, compression of the spine will happen. So you have fractures of your vertebral column. And if you go beyond 20 G, or sorry, there's compression of the spine up to 15G. And if you go up to 20G, then there's fracture of your vertebral column. Now, for negative G, the opposite happens. So for example, from high altitude, you fall. No? Let's say you're in an upright position and you accelerate downward. So you fall. So here, blood is translocated to the upper portions of the body. So negative G, you'll have hyperemia in the head, no? Psychotic disturbances, and cerebral edema. Now, rupture of your cerebral vessels are prevented because as pressure in the upper extremities, or sorry, in the upper portions of the body increase. Remember, the skull is a closed system, and within the skull or within the brain, you have your cerebrospinal fluid. So the pressure in the skull, no, also increases. So this is an increase in your intracranial pressure. So that increase in intracranial pressure will prevent rupture of your blood vessels, no? So this typically happens at negative 20 Gs. However, the retinal vessels are not protected by the skull. So when you have a negative G, blood vessels will dilate and the increase in pressure will might rupture your retinal vessels. So this is called your red out. Okay. Space flight. So if by chance you get to experience space travel, no, initial launch, so the first acceleration stage would be around 9G. So in order to prevent problems posed by your 9G forces or positive 9G forces, you will lie or you are in a reclining position. So that will prevent much of the blood being translocated to the lower extremity, no? And take note that at higher velocities, deceleration is done slowly. So the faster your initial velocity is, deceleration is conducted more slowly. So you can't just, stop abruptly, no? Now, books will say that 10G is the limit for safety, but this requires proper training and equipment. So here you have your anti-G suits, and individuals should be properly trained together with the anti-G or anti-gravity suits. So these anti-G suits typically exert pressure in the extremities, most especially in the lower extremities. So this will prevent blood from, or much of the blood to pull down to the lower extremity. So that maintains central circulation. At the same time, these individuals are trained to contract their abdominal muscles and lean forward, no? So this will prevent pulling of the blood going to from the upper portions of the body, let's say in the head, going down to the vena cava. So that more or less would maintain blood within the cerebral circulation. So that will prevent these travelers from, losing consciousness. Okay. Now let's talk about free-falling bodies. So imagine yourself, you are in a plane and you will do skydiving, no? So at the moment of drop, no, once you jump out of the plane, so initially there will be zero velocity, no? So gravitational force is equal to your weight. But in the first 2 seconds, no, of course, you will slowly accelerate because of gravity. So take note, the acceleration of a free-falling object due to gravity is around 9.8 meters per second. So initially, there is a gradual increase in the velocity, no? As acceleration gradually increases. So force of air resistance is small, but the force of gravity is more or less the same. So the acceleration due to force of gravity is greater than force exerted by your air resistance. So this typically happens in the first 2 seconds of your fall. In the next few seconds, no, the acceleration due to the force of gravity is still high, but the force of air resistance now has increased. So the object, as it descends, no, the rate of acceleration is decreased compared to the first 2 seconds. So as the body falls, no, rate of acceleration is decreased, but the velocity of your fall increases until you reach terminal velocity. No? So acceleration due to force of gravity, no, by about or after 12 seconds, acceleration due to gravity is now equal to the deceleration exerted by your air resistance. That typically happens around 12 seconds of your fall. You would have reached terminal velocity, meaning rate of acceleration now is 0 and your velocity now is constant at 175 feet per second. So this is now your velocity as you go down onto the ground. No? So this is called your terminal velocity. Now, of course, you have a parachute. So if you're at terminal velocity and you suddenly open your parachute, of course, you have sudden deceleration. That sudden deceleration will exert around 1,200 pounds opening shock, no? If you're falling at terminal velocity. So you just imagine yourself being pulled up again because of the opening of your parachute. Of course, if you are not properly trained, that could injure, that could produce injury. Now, when the parachute is open, descent is typically around 20 feet per second. Now, when you hit the ground, it is important to properly land, no? With bent knees. Bent knees will absorb some of the shock, no? As you hit the ground. If your legs are outstretched, so the impact might cause fractures. So having bent knees will act as a shock absorber to prevent injuries. Okay. Another example is, for example, when you go to space, to outer space. So other problems would include the climate you have in the space shuttle or in the space station and radiation. Now, with today's technology, in the space shuttles and in the space stations, typically there is an artificial climate simulating the atmosphere at sea level. So here you have 760 millimeters mercury. So that's barometric pressure at sea level. And 20% of that is oxygen and around 80% of that is nitrogen. So this artificial climate simulates the condition of the atmosphere at sea level. So you have that with your space stations and your space shuttles. Now, of course, constant production of oxygen is the main problem. So here, technology has develop electrolysis so that in space stations and in space shuttles, there's a constant production of oxygen from water. And sometimes they use algae, no, to produce oxygen for the or during their stay in outer space. Now, other problems, you have your radiation. So radiation coming from space, radiation coming from the sun. Now, because of the magnetic field of the Earth, the radiation is trapped in the Van Allen radiation belt. So you have two belts. You have your inner belt and your outer belt. So the inner belt is around 300 to 3,000 miles above the surface, and the outer belt is around 6,000 to 20,000 miles above the surface of the Earth. So in order to prevent radiation sickness, typically astronauts, space shuttles, and space stations, they orbit below 300 miles above the surface, no? So that prevents them from coming into contact with the Van Allen radiation belt. Now, when they go back to Earth, no, or typically when they leave and then when they go back, they typically leave or return near or at the poles, no, because much of the radiation is at the equator or near the equator. Other problems, you have weightlessness. So weightlessness in space, there's motion sickness. So this is due to disturbance in the vestibular system. Translocation of your body fluids, no? Problems in your cardiovascular function, no? Reduced physical activity. So all of these are seen in astronauts, no? Having prolonged weightlessness. So eventually, muscle strength will go down, no? Since resistance due to gravity is lost, no? Work capacity decreases, bone mass, bone density decreases, calcium and phosphate clearance would increase. So less mineralization of the bone, and calcium and phosphate will be excreted from the body. Red cell mass will go down, blood volume will go down, no? Maximum cardiac output will also go down. So the effect of gravity on the circulatory system is lost. So with that, orthostatic tolerance decreases, no? And the baroreceptor reflex is impaired. So these things happen when you have prolonged weightlessness, and the symptoms are more evident when these space travelers return to Earth or on the surface of the Earth. Okay. Now we go to deep sea physiology. Unlike air or space travel, when we go to greater depths or underwater, barometric pressure increases. No, barometric pressure increases. Now, if you look at the table here, this table will show to us varying depths and the pressure within these depths and the volume of the gas. No? So, recall now your Boyle's law. So, Boyle's law simply states that if you increase the pressure, the volume of the gas decreases. So, let's follow this law. So, for example, at sea level, so this is 760 millimeters mercury. So, that's 1 atmosphere. Let's say you have 1 liter of gas. No? For every 30 feet dive below sea level, you add 1 atmosphere. So at 33 feet, so you add 1 atmosphere. So this is now 2 atmospheres. And the volume of the gas is now half. Going to 66 feet below sea level. So that's +1 +2. So that's 3 atmospheres already. So this further reduces your volume to 0.33 liters. Of course, as you go deeper, the volume of the gas decreases proportionately. No? Now, typically for divers, at less than 120 feet below sea level, no? This is for seasoned recreational divers, they're typically asymptomatic. So, recreational divers typically go to up to 100 feet below sea level only. Now, here are the problems posed by deep sea diving. Recall that as you go to greater depths, the water pressure increases. Water pressure increases. So if you're using a scuba gear, no? As you go down to greater depths, the pressure exerted by your air tank should also increase. Why? When you go to greater depths, water pressure increases. So this will press onto the body. This will press onto the body. No? So the air tank should exert an equal counter pressure so that the chest will properly expand. If water pressure is greater than the pressure exerted by your air tank, no? If the water pressure is greater compared to the pressure of your air tank, the chest cannot expand, you cannot inflate your lungs. However, if the air pressure of your air tank is higher compared to the water pressure, so more pressure is pumped into the thorax or into the lungs, the alveoli will burst. So that's also a problem. So naturally, as water pressure increases, air pressure should match that. No? So as you go down to greater depths, water pressure increases. At the same time, the pressure exerted by your scuba tank will also increase, matching the water pressure. So with that, air must be supplied at greater pressures. Now, in this table, this will show to us the partial pressures of your nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water at sea level and as we go to greater depths. Recall now Henry's law. So Henry's law states that the amount of gas dissolved in fluid is directly proportional to the pressure of the gas with which that fluid is exposed to. So, for example, the barometric pressure at sea level is 1 atmosphere. So that's 760 millimeters mercury. This is the partial pressures of the individual gases. No? So around 78% will be nitrogen and around 21% will be oxygen. Now, if you go down 33 feet below sea level, and let's say your scuba tank simulates the air that we breathe. So again, that's 78% nitrogen and 28% oxygen. Notice that there's an increase in the nitrogen and oxygen tension. No? Much more if you go to 99 feet below sea level. No? So this simply means that as you go to greater depths, the pressure of your scuba tank should match the pressure of the water. Therefore, the pressure exerted by the gases, namely nitrogen and oxygen, will also increase proportionately. No? Now, if you're wearing a scuba tank, the maximum safe depth is around 200 feet below sea level. But this is only true if you have proper training and proper equipment. No? Now, problems posed by deep sea diving. So first, you have nitrogen toxicity. So if you will notice, as you go to greater depths, the tension of nitrogen increases. But since nitrogen is not being used by the body, normally it just stays there. However, when you stay for prolonged periods of time, no, underwater and at great depths, nitrogen will be dissolved in plasma, and nitrogen will be dissolved in tissues. When that happens, nitrogen will now alter neuronal excitability of your cells, since the cell membrane contains a lot of free fatty acids. So nitrogen will be dissolved in cell membranes. So that will now alter conductance of your ions, causing now a decrease in your neuronal excitability. So this is now your narcotic effect, no? So let's look at the symptoms as we go to greater depths. So this is at 1 hour duration. Narcotic effect at 100 feet below sea level, you'll experience euphoria, no? However, 1 hour duration at 150 to 200 feet below sea level, there's slight drowsiness. 200 to 250 feet, there's severe drowsiness, weakness, clumsiness, etc. And at greater than 250 feet below sea level, the diver becomes useless. Now, these are the symptoms of the ruptures of the depth. Now, books will describe this as being intoxicated by alcohol. So that's the symptoms when you have nitrogen toxicity, no? For carbon dioxide toxicity, this is somehow it is solved already. Most especially if you're wearing modern breathing apparatus like your scuba gear. Simply because carbon dioxide does not accumulate in the body. Your scuba gear is designed so that when you inhale, only oxygen and nitrogen are taken in. And when you exhale, you do not exhale into the scuba tank. You exhale out into the water. So carbon dioxide is blown out into the water. So carbon dioxide will not accumulate if you're wearing the proper scuba tank. However, if you're wearing a rebreathing helmet, no? Rebreathing helmet, carbon dioxide will accumulate, no? So carbon dioxide is trapped in the dead space within the rebreathing helmet. So with that, accumulation of carbon dioxide will now result to or will lead to respiratory acidosis. Another problem is oxygen toxicity, no? Because as you go to greater depths, the O2 tension being released by your scuba tank increases. So you now have more oxygen being delivered to the body. So here, oxygen dissolved in arterial blood will increase, but O2 saturation remains the same. So it's still 100%. So what you have now is more and more oxygen being dissolved in plasma. But normally, the tissues will only take up 5 ml of oxygen, no? They will only utilize 5 ml of oxygen. But because of the increased amounts of oxygen, no, being delivered by your tank, this oxygen, no, will now form as your free radicals, no? You have your peroxides, you have your hydrogen, your peroxide free radicals, your hydrogen peroxide, you have your oxidation of your polyunsaturated free fatty acids. So all of these free radicals will cause damage to cells, no? So that will now result to oxygen toxicity. So at greater than 700 millimeters mercury oxygen, so you have substernal distress, coughing greater than 3040 millimeters mercury. You can have dizziness, fainting, convulsions, and coma. So since cell membranes contain a lot of polyunsaturated free fatty acids, no? Oxidative stress will act on these molecules, and cell membranes of neurons are most susceptible, no? And exercise also aggravates the symptoms because this will increase oxygen demand, and by increasing oxygen demand, then more oxygen will diffuse going to these tissues. You will also have pulmonary disability because too much oxygen in the alveoli will cause peripheral vasodilation, no? Or not, sorry, not peripheral vasodilation, but pulmonary vasodilation. So when your pulmonary blood vessels dilate, so more blood can now flow through, so that increases your hydrostatic pressure. So this can cause difficulty of breathing, secondary to pulmonary edema, no? Pulmonary congestion, etc. Another problem being faced by divers is decompression sickness. So again, when we go to greater depths, more and more of your gases will be dissolved in plasma. Now, for decompression sickness, this is particularly true for nitrogen. So nitrogen, for as long as we stay underwater, no, they dissolve in body fluids and they just stay there. No, they are not utilized by the tissues. So for every 33 feet below sea level, so you add around 1 liter of nitrogen being dissolved in the body. So for as long as we stay within that depth, no, there will be no problems. The problem happens when you rapidly resurface. Because rapid ascent, you have a drastic drop exerted by the water pressure, and that will be matched by the pressure of your air tank. So the pressure of the air tank or the scuba tank will also decrease, no? And based on Henry's law, the rapid drop in the pressure exerted by the tank will force gases out of solution. This will force gases out of solution. So with that, nitrogen bubbles may form. So in the tissues, so you have formation of bubbles within tissues, in the interstitial compartment, within body fluids. You will also have bubble formation in the blood vessels. So in the smaller blood vessels, so you can have areas that may be ischemic, and when these when these small bubbles coalesce to form larger ones, then they can occlude larger blood vessels. So here you can have joint pain, so bubbles forming within the joints or in the synovial fluid. You can have dizziness, collapse, mental disorder, paralysis, so the nervous system is affected. Chokes, bubbles form in the pulmonary circulation, so blood cannot flow through your pulmonary capillaries. You have pulmonary embolism, pulmonary edema. In the heart, you can have myocardial infarct. So in order to prevent bends or decompression sickness, training is also essential. So there is a slow ascent. So if you read your books, there's a schedule there. If you descend to, let's say, 190 feet below sea level, and then you stay there for an hour. So this is the schedule of ascent at 190 feet below sea level and staying there for 1 hour. So first, you go to 50 feet, no, below sea level, and you stay there for 10 minutes. And then after that, go 40 feet, stay there for 17 minutes. Then you go up 30 feet, 19 minutes, then 20 feet, 50 minutes, and then 10 feet below sea level, 84 minutes. So roughly you have around 3 hours of decompression. So that's the schedule of ascent. if you stay at, this is 190 feet below sea level, 1 hour, no? So that's the schedule of ascent. So this will give time for the body to remove excess nitrogen, no? So nitrogen is blown out into the water. Now, in order to minimize the effects of decompression sickness, many scuba tanks will now utilize helium-oxygen mixtures instead of nitrogen-oxygen mixtures. No, helium has less narcotic effect. It is an inert gas, so this is not used by the body or tissues. They are less soluble compared to nitrogen. Their density is lower, so we have less resistance, no? And helium rapidly diffuses out of your tissues, no? So also with helium oxygen mixture, as you go to greater depths, the amount of oxygen that will be delivered, no, for more sophisticated scuba tanks, the amount of oxygen being delivered will be less as you go to greater depths. So that prevents oxygen toxicity. Now, should decompression sickness happen, let's say you resurface rapidly and then nitrogen bubbles form, no? What we typically do is hyperbaric therapy. So you could use a hyperbaric chamber or you could use hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So for your hyperbaric chamber, so this is a chamber, you place the diver or the patient inside, you seal it, and then you increase the pressure. So the chamber is airtight, and then you gradually increase the pressure to the pressure of the water when the diver or during the diver's descent. So after which you gradually decrease the ambient pressure. So you're simulating now your decompression schedule. No? So with the gradual reduction in your barometric pressure, this will give time for the respiratory system to eliminate, no, excess nitrogen. No? So typically oxygen or the pressure of oxygen is delivered at 2 to 3 atmospheres. So these are the conditions where hyperbaric chamber or hyperbaric O2 therapy is indicated. Now the difference of your hyperbaric chamber to your hyperbaric O2 therapy is your hyperbaric O2 therapy, you simply use a mask, no? Or you intubate the patient and you deliver high pressure or high concentrations of oxygen, no? So those are the differences between your hyperbaric chamber and your O2 or hyperbaric O2 therapy. And these are the contraindications of your hyperbaric therapy, no? Okay, so with that, I hope with this lecture you've reviewed a few concepts in basic pulmonology and basic cardiovascular physiology or cardiology, and how they are applied in situations at space travel, high altitude, um, G-forces, and of course, diving physiology. So this has been Ronald Alan Cruz, and thank you for listening.